Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about the stimulant epidemic and the implications that may have for those on those with ADHD on stimulant medications. So as usual, I'll start with the take-home message, and then in 2 minutes or so, I'll jump into the main meat of the discussion. So the take-home message is that over the last 20 years, the rates of prescription stimulant prescribing have dramatically increased, and the number of deaths from overdose from stimulant medications also increased substantially. That's stimulant medications and cocaine and meth. So it includes prescription and illicit stimulants. Currently, the DEA is revising its regulations for prescribing controlled substances via telemedicine. And although they've delayed those decisions several times already, and we'll get into the details of that, they are scheduled to make announcements before the end of the year, before the end of 2024, and I believe it will happen in the next month or so to give people time to prepare for the changes. And I believe there will be changes that they have proposed earlier that target the business model of those using telepsychiatry, teleassessment for ADHD purposes. So they are specifically concerned about those teleclinics, and I will go into why. So the main part of the presentation. And I'll be using lots of numbers. Hopefully I'll make it clear what I'm talking about each time. So over the last several years in the United States, more than 100,000 individuals each year have died from drug overdoses, primarily opioids, and opioids have gotten most of the attention. The DEA and CDC announced just a few weeks ago that there was actually a decline last year with the data compiled for the last 12-month period. Total number is still above 100,000, but it's the first decline we've seen in many years. Now, I should make clear that when the DEA, the CDC, and the others are discussing overdose deaths, they are including unintentional overdoses, they are including intentional suicides by these particular substances, and they're actually even including murders committed by forcing someone to take an overdose of any of these substances. Unintentional deaths seem to be the major component, but most of the organizations are not breaking it down more finely. So comparing just the last less than 22 dozen years, and part of it is the data is never completely up to date up into time, but there have been several surveys looking at the period from 2000 to about 2022, 2020, somewhere in there. So around 2000 in the US, all drugs of all illicit substances or prescription opioids, things like that, there were less than 10,000 deaths a year. And that skyrocketed again to over 100,000 deaths from those substances. That's a tenfold increase. It's dramatically. Jumping back to 2000, stimulants included less than 4,000 of those deaths. And of that 4,000, the vast majority, more than 80% of that was illicit cocaine deaths. And now the most recent numbers in the 2022-23 range show that more than 57,000 of the overdose deaths involved people with stimulant medications and street stimulants in their bloodstream. Now, that doesn't mean just stimulant medications. So the vast majority of those were opioid and stimulants combined, but that's a huge increase. And what's of note also is that unlike in 2000, about 2 dozen years ago, when the vast majority of overdose deaths were attributable to cocaine, now what they usually break out is stimulants with abuse potential, with this meth, methamphetamine, amphetamine, and Ritalin, methylphenidate. Those now outnumber the deaths involving cocaine. So the stimulants, again, that's still blurring prescription versus illicit drugs, and it's very clear that street meth is killing far more people than prescription amphetamine. But since many people are sharing, there's lots of overlap and cross use. I'll get to one of those statistics a little bit later. So deaths from overall overdose deaths are maybe stabilizing the last few years. Deaths, interesting, from heroin actually peaked in about 2015 and have been declining since then. And opioids without fentanyl in them, any contamination, any intentional administration of fentanyl, just prescription opioid deaths have actually been declining since 2016. So we have success in some parts of the substance abuse field, but other areas are increasing. So again, when we're looking more specifically at overdose deaths from a time period of 2010 to 2021, where we went in the U.S. from less than 40,000 a year killed a year in 2010 to more than 106,000 killed in 2021 by overdose deaths. So more than 2.5 times increased number of deaths. But if you look at what those substances were, people were taking both fentanyl and a stimulant together, accounted for less than 1% of those deaths in 2010. So a minuscule portion, but almost a third of them by 2021 had both fentanyl and stimulants in their system. 32% of those dying from an overdose. And the projection is that within the next year or two, that category of fentanyl and a stimulant will be the biggest share of overdose deaths in the United States. So it's very close right now. Right now, still, fentanyl without stimulants is the highest proportion of people being overdose deaths, but the rate of increase with fentanyl and stimulants together is almost certain to surpass it in the next year or two. On the other hand, stimulants without fentanyl, again, they made up almost 15% of those less than 40,000 deaths in 2010. The percentage of pure stimulant overdose has increased as a total of the share. It's about 18% now. But again, that's 18% of a much bigger total number of deaths. So certainly absolute number of deaths of stimulant without any fentanyl involvement at all have gone up dramatically. And some have called this current wave of fentanyl plus stimulant death the fourth wave of the opioid epidemic. Some have said, no, we should be calling this the new stimulant epidemic. To put that in perspective, we did have a first stimulant epidemic in the post-World War II era. So mid-1950s to the 1960s, deaths from stimulants skyrocketed. They weren't near the levels they are now, but in terms of total deaths, but as a percentage of people using them, they were actually higher at some points. And then that was followed years later by an opioid epidemic. Some people have suggested, some historians, that there are historical eras where we switch from stimulant to opioid epidemics, maybe because of something about the types of problems in the era. Others suggest that it's more as law enforcement cracks down on one type of abuse, then other forms of abuse are easier to slip in. So part of what I'm going to say next is borrowed from a presentation by the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency Assistant Administrator Matthew Straight. He's also the Senior Policy Advisor to the DEA, so he helps determine what their approaches are. And a reminder, in the U.S., the DEA has two very conflicting mandates. One is to reduce, eliminate, get rid of all illicit drugs flooding into the country, and two is to help manage and secure an appropriate supply of appropriate prescription-controlled substances like opioid pain medications and stimulants. And again, so one is a drug enforcement, keeping out all the illicit drugs, and 2 is allowing an adequate supply of approved drugs. So Mr. Straight has observed that there are several similar signs between the opioid epidemic, which may be cresting or receding now, versus the current stimulant epidemic. And again, he identifies that the stimulant epidemic started around in 1996 with the availability of prescription pain medications like OxyContin, and that overall deaths started rising dramatically. And then there was a second wave where there was major use of heroin as well, probably partly due to not being able to, patients who became addicted to pain medications, not being able to get those filled. So heroin took some of its place. The third wave was then the introduction of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids, although fentanyl was and remains the primary cause of death and misery in that group. So it's a much more potent opioid pain medicine. It's much easier to overdose to get the wrong amount, particularly since most users aren't even aware of how much, if any, fentanyl is in the fix they're currently using. And then the fourth wave, or maybe it's a brand new epidemic itself, is currently the fentanyl with stimulants epidemic. So Mr. Straight's argument is that there's 4 hallmarks of the opioid epidemic that we're repeating now. So 1 is identification of a medical problem and an increase in public health concern about it. I'll get into these in detail. 2 is assurance that addiction won't be a problem with this. 3 is exploitation of the internet with the availability of information and misinformation. And 4th is a pharmacologic proliferation of products, so more and more licit, FDA-approved products in this category becoming available, and then combined with lags in treatment and criminal networks working in, those are the parallels he sees between the two. So the first part is, for the opioid epidemic, it was in the mid-90s identifying that pain was an undertreated problem in medical treatment and in the medical community, working with patients, and the promotion that we should be considering pain as the 5th vital sign. So routinely, general practitioners, other doctors would take your heart rate, they'd measure your respiratory rate, they'd take your blood pressure, and they'd take your temperature, and they became encouraged that we should be asking on each visit, what's your pain level, and if it's a problem indicated there, then following up with more detailed questioning. The parallel now is that ADHD has been, for few decades now, been increasingly identified as a common medical problem and an undertreated one up until now, and that creates this public health institutionalized push or concern for more people to be on opioids for pain and stimulant medications for ADHD. So what I would say to that is I think there's certainly a grain of truth in it, and I would say the parallel may be stronger than Mr. Straight acknowledged in his public talks, and that is he sort of dismissed that we should have ever treated pain as a 5th vital sign. This is my interpretation of his comments. He did not say that explicitly, but a consequence of the opioid crackdown on the opioid epidemic is many people with chronic pain are being dismissed as too bad, that's not serious, so pain was a big problem, an undertreated problem. Did we swing the other direction and overtreat it in many people? Absolutely. But are we still continuing to undertreat it? Even more so now, probably. And ADHD, I believe, is a real phenomena. It really does kill people. It causes lots of distress and dysfunction without killing people. Are there some people with ADHD being identified who don't really have it? Undoubtedly. But are there still probably millions with full-blown classic ADHD who are suffering and dying prematurely because they're not treated or not identified? Absolutely. So I think, yes, there was a identification and medical systems and public health aspect, but that wasn't entirely a bad thing in either situation. So Two, there certainly has been, since I've been in this field for 30 years, lots of reassurance from ADHD experts that, problems with stimulant addiction are pretty rare. They're pretty uncommon. Yes, some people do. It's acknowledged it exists, but it's consistently minimized. And part of speaking to that, it's amazingly difficult to find rigorous research on rates of addiction with prescription stimulants. So I've searched and searched. You can find studies that look at misuse, which are including anytime someone's not using their medications according to their prescription, but actual addiction studies, it's hard to get hard numbers. What I've usually heard over the years, it's maybe 2 or 3 or 4%. And that's in kids whose brains are developing. They're probably more at risk than adults if you're starting it there. But the very paucity of data speaks to the fact that, yes, I think we have been given assurances and underestimating the potential for problems there. Third is the exploitation of the internet, and there have been numerous articles written about how much information, and TikTok gets singled out, but particularly pitched at young people, particularly talking these days openly, freely about mental health, even to some extent glorifying it as an essential part of people's identity. At the same time, the internet itself, I am arguing, is pushing all of us in an ADHD more like direction. So more information, more availability, more normalization of taking medications to treat a problem. And then 4 was the pharmacologic proliferation of products. So not only did we have OxyContin, we had all sorts of other more and more potent synthetic opioids, prescription opioids, and different delivery systems. So there was a surge in products available, and that meant companies were then marketing and competing against each other. I mean, they did wind up growing the pie, but there was a fight over the pie itself or share of the pie, which causes, again, a surge in prescribing and use. And we are absolutely seeing that. I mean, not just the number of different products, but in his analysis, he actually, each dosage of a different, so if Concert is available in 1836, 45, and 54, that's actually 4 different new products by his counting. But there's been a dramatic surge in the last 10 years in stimulant products used to treat ADHD. And in terms of criminal gang involvement, there's in drugs that the DEA intercepts and tests, there has been a surge in the percentage of drugs which are, usually most of those have been fake OxyContin containing, lots and lots of them contain fentanyl, but mostly opioid focused, but increasingly in the last few years, many of these products, they're also finding criminal gangs moving into the stimulant market. So fake versions of Adderall are out there now and much more available than before. So looking just at the prescription stimulant practices, which is, again, in this model, that's what pushed along the opioid crisis. And I should say, again, less than 10,000 deaths from all overdose causes in about 2000. Even at the height of the opioid epidemic, the prescription opioids, and I don't want to minimize this because each death is horrible and a tragedy, but never was there more than 20,000 people in a year dying from prescription stimulants. And again, the last few years we've hit 100,000. I mean, it represents what a huge percentage of those deaths have been caused by fentanyl. Anyway, between 2012 and 2022, so a 10-year span, there was an increase from about 12 million to about 16 million in terms of patients in the U.S. who were taking stimulant prescription medications. That's a 33% increase about, but a even bigger increase in the number of actual prescriptions written. So almost a 60% increase over that decade time span. And interestingly, even though most of the focus and concern has been directed at, we're rotting kids' brains, we're getting youngsters hooked, it's, people kids are using it and passing around all these stimulants in high schools and middle schools, maybe even elementary schools. There's actually been, over that 10-year period, a slight decrease in stimulant use among children and adolescents. Almost all the increase there has been in adults over the age of 21, and particularly in women. And some would say those are the groups we have historically underdiagnosed ADHD, under-recognized it. We should be seeing increases in that population because this is a real condition with a real treatment in terms of stimulants, making it symptoms diminish. But so that's, again, one interesting thing is our attention is on the kids, but it's not the kids, it's the adults where this is the biggest changes in the last decade. And interestingly, and I wasn't aware of this data, I will try to include a graph of this if I can figure out how to do that. But in terms of who actually is prescribing these medications, so again, I'm comparing 2012 to 2022. So in 2012, the biggest chunk of prescribers were psychiatrists, so more than, and this is number of prescriptions a year. Almost 16 million prescriptions for stimulants a year were being written by psychiatrists in 2012. 10 years later, in 2022, that number is only about 17 million, barely an increase. In terms of pediatricians, they were pretty close in 2012, 12 million versus 16 among the psychiatrists. That number actually dropped to 11 million. So pediatricians are writing fewer prescriptions. Part of that may be, again, greater comfort and greater familiarity with adult psychiatrists and adult general practitioners. So 20 years ago, it was not unusual for pediatricians to be treating someone with ADHD until their 30s or 40s because no one else around knew how to treat ADHD, and they'd been working with the person for years. So the other group, the family practitioners, 2012, wrote about half the amount of prescriptions for stimulants, about 8 million, compared again to the psychiatrist 16. But that number shot up to 12 million, so their rate bumped up more than 50%, while pediatricians were decreasing and psychiatrists were pretty much holding steady. But the big eye-opener was one group of prescribers in 2012 were writing less than 4 million prescriptions a year, and now are writing not just more than the family practice docs, not just more than the pediatricians, not just more than psychiatrists, they are writing more than any other professional group at 18 million prescriptions. Those are nurse practitioners. So in 2012, they represented less than a tenth of those prescriptions for stimulants that were written. Now they are at approximately a third of the total. So that's a dramatic change. And a big part of it is the telemedicine model, which is hiring people. It's cheaper to pay a nurse practitioner than a doctor. So there's a gravitation towards people with less credentialing and less educational training because they can be paid less in that scenario. I mean, the nurse practitioners I know of from working in San Francisco who specifically had an interest or emphasis in ADHD were every bit as intelligent, careful, and good people as the psychiatrists I know in that area. So I'm not trying to make a blanket statement that all nurse practitioners are bad or dangerous prescribers, but the DEA is very strongly building a case that there is, again, the least trained group of professionals is accounting for a huge share of the increase in prescribing practice. So interestingly, and Mr. Straight didn't make this comparison, but we do have the first ADHD, our first stimulant medication epidemic to look at too, and I wasn't aware of some of these details, and I won't go into it in great. So again, stimulants were developed in the 30s and 40s, and then many of the ads that they were pushed for in the 40s and 50s before, again, the leading edge of before became a real problem. they were being promoted specifically for depression. So there's a parallel again that identifying a mental health problem, identifying depression, and identifying this is a treatment for them was sort of an entryway into a bigger market. So then they became more widely used for low energy, more widely used for appetite suppression. Then they were used extensively by the military to keep people capable of fighting 24/7, and a substantial number of veterans got addicted that way, and that seeped into the general community. So the DEA has also voiced concern that although we have clear practice guidelines by pediatric communities written for how to treat pediatric ADHD and what medications are most appropriate, there are not very extensive or very well-developed practice guidelines in place for ADHD, adult ADHD, according to them. And jumping around, part of the concern, again, is this blurring with the opioid epidemic itself. Again, what's strange, and we didn't see it as much decades ago when we had stimulants and opioids together, is this massive use of using them together. So again, more people seem to be using fentanyl or another opioid with their stimulant together than are using pure stimulants or pure opioids right now. And one other statistic that's been cited that a third of the people who are misusing prescription stimulants have also used cocaine. So there seems to be considerable overlap between prescription. Again, that was misusers, so it's hard to know how many of them were really abusing, but there does seem to be a substantial overlap between prescription stimulant misuse, abuse, and potentially cocaine, methamphetamine misuse and abuse. The other things the DEA presentation by Mr. Strait pointed out is that looking at the statistics, the telemedication companies that are focusing on ADHD don't even seem to be individualizing treatment. So there seem to be amazing consistency that everyone gets this standard dose. There's much higher percentage of prescriptions for immediate release Adderall products than for extended release. And that is particularly noted in their prescriptions that are written by the nurse practitioners. So how or in what ways is this stimulant epidemic different than the opioid epidemic? So one important difference is that we do have treatments for opioid epidemic. So we have an important rescue treatment, so naloxone spray inhalation or administered other ways can immediately reverse the effects of potentially lethal opioid overdoses. We don't have anything that can reverse stimulant overdoses that quickly. And we do have buprenorphine and methadone and other replacement treatments. Some, discuss whether these should be ongoing treatments or just a switching over and then weaning people off. But there are substitutes for heroin, morphine, street stimulant, fentanyl, prescription opioid abuse, which seem to be safer and lead to fewer mental health problems. We don't have any replacement treatment for stimulants, or maybe we do. And by that I mean, so two things. That some people often say, well, that we don't have any treatments for stimulant abuse or stimulant abuse or addiction or problems. There are a few studies looking both at Wellbutrin and at bupropion and at mirtazapine, which is Remeron, that either of these substances in fairly small studies so far seem to help to some extent with craving. They seem to help reduce use or help increase the likelihood of abstaining among stimulant abusers. It's not a dramatic, everyone's helped by these. It's certainly not a cure-all, but it's a meaningful help for some proportion of people. And there's also a fair amount of research on a behavioral therapy approach called contingency management, which is shaping people's behavior by giving them, monitoring their behavior, often by urine tox screens and other tests like that, and giving them rewards for good behavior. That does seem to shape behavior and help with abstinence. I'll also just throw in, there are a handful of studies looking at Vyvanse in the setting of people who have both ADHD and have a substance abuse addiction, including stimulant addiction. And there's a small number, but consistent evidence suggesting Vyvanse, a prescription stimulant, can be helpful in addressing ADHD symptoms so people can more effectively deal with their illicit substance abuse. So this is conjecture, what the DEA is going to propose, but I think the very existence of Mr. Straight having essentially a forum where he reached out to all the psychiatrists in the country or doctors in the country, and anyone who was interested could sign up for this 1-hour discussion that's being repeated. I think they're going to make some changes that people are not prepared or ready for. I might be wrong. We'll know in the next few months. Happy to be wrong if it's wrong. So a little backup. In February of 2023, the DEA proposed some rules so backing up even further. When the COVID epidemic was declared as a public health emergency, there was immediate relaxation of many of the rules that were previously in place for telemedicine. And telemedicine, not just in psychiatry, but across medicine, shot up incredibly in terms of percentage of visits, people using it for that purpose rather than going in live to the doctor's office, which made sense when we were quarantining and trying to prevent breathing on each other. So in February of 2023, it was pretty clear we had a better handle on COVID, certainly still with us now, but number of deaths were decreasing dramatically. And there was a projection that in May of 2023, which came to pass, the public health emergency would be ended. So in February of 2023, the DEA proposed several changes for how telemedicine is administered and preserving some of the new flexibility that came in with COVID, but rolling back some of those provisions. I'll get into some of the details in a second. They had a 30-day comment period requesting any feedback from the public, and there were more than 38,000 comments received. Many of the times they request feedback from the public, it's fewer than 1,000, fewer than even 100 comments. Lots of people had strong opinions, and the indications are that the vast majority of these comments were saying, don't make these proposed, don't go ahead with your proposed restrictions. They're too burdensome. They're going to really have a negative impact on mental health, particularly those with ADHD. So 2 days before the May 11th public health emergency was officially ended, the DEA and Department of Health and Human Services extended all the telemedicine flexibility rules that were in place for another 6 months. So rather than enacting what they had proposed, they punted for half a year. And then in October of 2023, when it became close to the time they were going to announce what they were doing or not going to, change or not change, they punted again till the end of this year, 2024, officially December 31st. New rules will take up place. But they did indicate that they would be letting people know before December 31st. So presumably sometime, and I've heard dates in October or November for this year, 2024, what's going to happen. Now, the most onerous or burdensome one is that for Schedule II drugs, and this includes Adderall, Ritalin, all amphetamine and methylphenidate products, that they would require before a first prescription that the individual saw a doctor in person. So their first prescription could not be a telemedicine visit. But once I had gotten that one visit in, all the rest for the rest of their life with that practitioner could be remotely done. They also made it clear that there'd be probably stronger enforcement. Currently, there's restrictions on writing only for a 30-day supply, but that a doctor can write 3 one-month prescriptions for 30-day supplies. The second and third months have to say, do not fill before a certain date, do not fill before the next date, and strongly requiring or indicating that someone needed to be evaluated before their next 90-day prescription. Again, it's not officially a 90-day prescription. So, one thing is these restrictions are very clearly targeting specifically the telepsychiatry evaluation for ADHD medication clinics, because they're not questioning whether or not someone can actually make a valid diagnosis of ADHD via telesession. They're not saying that clearly. And if you really thought in-person was essential, why would one visit once in the person's lifetime be good enough for ongoing treatment? Wouldn't you want at least some periodic check-in again? But again, the data suggests that much of this increase in prescribing has been triggered by these clinics, which have less supervision, are delivering less individualized treatment, and are primarily relying on people with less training and or expertise. So is it possible that they will delay again? They might, but that would be in parallel to, in the US, Homeland Security has been wanting to have real ID passes where there's scannable coded information that can be read off readers, and it's essentially a universal ID needed for boarding an airplane and other causes. That delay, that rollout of the mandated real ID passes has been delayed so often that just a few months ago, when the Department of Homeland Security delayed that again, explicitly said, we're delaying it again because we've delayed it so many times, nobody believes that we're really going to have a deadline, so nobody's done it, or less than half the population. So they've requested that be delayed from May 2025 to May 2027. I do not think the DEA is going to delay again. They've delayed long enough, and they've indicated they are concerned enough about the the stimulant crisis, that we need to do something. Or they need to do something. So we will see what the months ahead bring. I would say part of this should highlight that although I believe the evidence suggests most people with ADHD use their medications responsibly and appropriately, even if it's not always strictly completely to the letter of how they were written. There are clearly some people who are sharing medication. There are clearly some who are selling medication. And there are clearly thousands of individuals in the US who have become addicted and died from their addiction to stimulant substances. So this isn't just a one-sided issue. There are concerns, health concerns on both sides of it. So that's all for today. Thanks for sticking with me, and stay healthy, stay happy.